Bofriend almost killed me. I met him on a rainy Thursday in early spring, which, in retrospect, feels like an omen. Rainstorms have always given me a sense of unease. Their gloom, their unpredictability. And meeting him under those heavy clouds at a crowded train station should have been my first clue. But it was not. In fact, there was something oddly comforting about the way he offered me his umbrella when mine flipped inside out in the downpour. He was charming, with an easy smile and a warm laugh that drew me in. His name was Ezra. He wore a beaten denim jacket, carried too many coffee loyalty cards in his wallet, and possessed a knack for flattery that I found disarming. That day, after we introduced ourselves, he invited me for coffee. Over steaming mugs, we realized we shared a taste for old jazz records, art house films, and an aversion to large crowds. In no time we were talking like old friends, and he insisted on paying for my cappuccino as an apology for my ruined umbrella. I left that cafe thinking, this is a good man, someone I can trust. For the first year of our relationship, all my initial impressions seemed correct. We dated casually, then more seriously, and eventually we found ourselves seeing each other almost every day. He planned thoughtful little excursions to local museums, and wrote sweet notes he'd sneak into my mailbox. He brought me daffodils simply because I once said I liked the color yellow. We even spent a whole afternoon painting his living room walls pale lavender, giggling as we accidentally stepped into paint trays. When I'd mentioned my insecurities about my disability, my difficulty walking without a crutch on tougher days, he insisted it didn't matter, and acted as though he'd love me no matter what. In those first 12 months, I truly believed this was the man of my dreams. Devoted, considerate, patient, the kind of partner who never forgets small acts of kindness. What I did not know was that behind every romantic gesture, behind every day spent curled up on his worn leather couch, there lurked a shadow. As it turns out, he was unfaithful from the very start. He told me he'd ended things with his previous girlfriend months before we met. Later, I learned he had never truly broken up with her. In fact, they were still seeing each other on the weekends I thought he was visiting his mother. He also had an alarming fondness for one-night stands. Women from bars, from online dating apps, women he'd smile at in the line at the grocery store. I discovered that his phone was an endless web of half-truths and excuses. He told me once that the thousands of texts I found from unknown numbers were from old friends. I wanted so badly to believe him. During that first year, his duplicity was carefully masked by his charm. Then slowly, the mask began to slip. The first sign was subtle. I noticed he was always protective of his phone. If it buzzed in the middle of the night, he jumped to answer. If I went anywhere near where he'd left it charging, he'd hurry to snatch it up, pocketing it with a tight smile. Then I began catching glimpses of a different side of him. He was moody in the mornings, brushing off my attempts to cuddle with a curt, "Not now." Later, in public, he'd still hold my hand. But if I asked small questions, like how his day was, he'd snap at me. "Why are you prying?" One evening, about 10 months into our relationship, I glimpsed a suspicious text from a woman named Naomi. It read, "Are you still coming tonight or what?" I didn't recognize the name. My heart pounded. But, in my naive hope that we were solid, I told myself Naomi was probably a coworker or a cousin. I'd learned not to question him too directly, yet a small flame of worry ignited inside me, one that wouldn't go out for months. By the time we reached our first anniversary, his behavior changed so drastically that I felt like I was dating a different man entirely. The sweet little notes and daffodils were gone. Instead, he started blaming me for things that made no sense. If I suggested we watch a movie, he claimed I was forcing him to waste time. If I asked him to help me walk to the car with my crutch, he snapped that I was too needy, that I should learn to handle my disability by myself. Soon, his criticisms escalated to a more damaging degree. He began to insult me openly, telling me I was worthless, that I was lucky he stuck around given my disability. He said it so many times with such conviction that I almost believed him. Then came the nights where he wouldn't come home, or the days he'd vanish for hours, returning with flimsy excuses. I got stuck in traffic, or I was at the hardware store, lost track of time. More texts from unknown women appeared on his phone. The illusions shattered when I discovered an entire thread. He'd been dating someone else for months, taking her to fancy restaurants, attending movie theaters and romantic getaways, experiences he hardly ever gave me. When I confronted him in tears, he sneered that it was none of my business, and locked himself in the bedroom. One evening I found a medical bill hidden under a pile of junk mail. It was in his name, referencing treatment for a contagious infection. My mind spun. He'd never mentioned being ill or receiving any medication, but soon after I discovered I was infected too. When I told him, half in tears, half in terror, he claimed it was all my fault, that my immune system was weak, that I was overreacting. That's the day I realized I was living with someone capable of extreme cruelty, someone who could endanger my health and blame me for it. It was around that time that his abusive behavior became more than just emotional or psychological. The first time he struck me, it wasn't a slap or a punch. It was a shove that sent me staggering back, scraping my arm against the corner of the living room table. "Stop overreacting," he said, with a dismissive wave. Days later, he shoved me again, this time so forcefully that I dropped onto the hardwood floor, nearly twisting my ankle. In the aftermath, he claimed I was being dramatic. That was a frequent line. Stop being dramatic. When I eventually mustered the courage to threaten leaving, he scoffed. "With your condition, no one else will want you." I remember crying silently in the bathroom that night, kneeling by the tub, tears dropping onto the tiles, feeling a sense of hopelessness. Strangely, a part of me still hoped he'd return to the sweet version I first met. He never did. The final straw came on a night when he was intoxicated. He returned home smelling of whiskey and perfume that wasn't mine. We argued, or more accurately, I tried to talk calmly while he raged and paced, telling me I was an embarrassment. In the heat of it, he grabbed my wrist and squeezed so hard I thought the bone would crackle. Then, with a single violent lunge, he slammed me against the wall. My head struck the plaster so hard my vision blurred. I gasped, crying out. He spat at me. "Don't you dare talk back to me again." That was it. I feared for my life. Somehow I managed to slip out of the apartment when he wasn't looking, hobbling outside in my pajamas and crutch, forcing myself not to sob lest he hear me. I went to the police station that same night, bruises blooming on my arm and a dull ache throbbing in my skull. I tried to file a report. The officer on duty looked tired. He took a few notes, nodded vaguely, and said they'd look into it. But days passed and nothing happened. Weeks passed and they told me they didn't have enough evidence to proceed. That's how it goes sometimes. Not enough evidence. I felt invisible. Abandoned. I left him. I moved in temporarily with a kind friend who had a spare couch. And for a while I thought maybe that was the end of the nightmare. I was out. I was free. I didn't have to see him again. But then I found out about the multiple infections he'd given me. For me, these were not trivial. My autoimmune condition means infections can escalate in a dangerous manner. Doctors told me the damage might be long-term, that I'd need expensive treatments, that there were no guarantees. Anger boiled within me. He had, in essence, stolen my health. He refused to acknowledge it, let alone apologize or help pay the medical costs. Meanwhile, I heard from mutual acquaintances that he was showering his new girlfriend, someone younger, healthy, apparently unsuspecting, with all the love-bombing gestures I once believed. Fancy restaurants, romantic getaways, elaborate gifts. I couldn't stand the unfairness. Here I was, saddled with medical bills and physical pain, while he gallivanted around living his best life. No accountability whatsoever. After our breakup, a swirl of rumors began. I contacted 2 of his ex-girlfriends to warn them about the infections, to ask if they'd had similar experiences. They had. Both of them told me to run away from him at all costs. Both claimed he'd also manipulated and hurt them. One shared that he'd left her with enormous debt from an apartment lease he never paid. The other said he had stolen money from her bank account. They, too, had tried to involve the police, but the system was slow, unresponsive, unconvinced. By their accounts, he was a serial user, a man who hopped from one partner to the next, gleaning what he could, leaving chaos behind. That's when the fantasies of revenge started cropping up in my mind. I imagined leaking his personal information, bank details, addresses, phone numbers, across the internet, letting the world know how vile he was. I thought of humiliating him, tagging him in social media posts that exposed his abusive behavior. I wanted him to pay for the nights I spent sobbing, for the bruises, for the infections, for the permanent damage done to my life. Whenever I pictured him in a restaurant smiling across the table at his new partner, I felt physically ill. Rage churned in my stomach. The desire to publicly destroy him overshadowed everything else. Yet I also felt torn. Was it too much? Part of me thought, maybe I should let go and focus on healing. Another part whispered, why should he get to move on so easily when he almost killed me? He had threatened my life, inflicted bodily harm, left me with medical issues that might never be resolved. Isn't justice warranted? Night after night, I scrolled through websites, reading about doxing and hacking, discovering the moral and legal ramifications. I knew that going down that road might put me in legal trouble, and there was no guarantee it'd truly ruin him. Still, a potent part of me yearned for that short-lived satisfaction of seeing him suffer. I even inquired half-seriously about finding a hacker who could break into his WhatsApp or Instagram. I wanted to warn every new woman he messaged. He is dangerous. Stay away. He might hurt you. But either I couldn't find a reliable hacker, or I realized it was too risky, or both. So that plan never materialized. Meanwhile, the police remained indifferent. They told me that without more evidence or witnesses, they couldn't press charges for assault. The bruises had faded by the time I spoke to a detective. My phone's photos of my injuries were inconclusive, and he refused to let me see or speak with any investigating officer about the infection angle. The detective half shrugged and said, "We see a lot of these domestic disputes. Unless we catch him in the act, there's not much we can do." It was maddening. Another moment where I felt invisible. As time passed, my health worsened. The infections triggered complications I hadn't anticipated. I spent days in the hospital, weak, exhausted, facing stacks of medical bills. My friend visited, her eyes clouded with worry. She asked gently, "Have you considered therapy? You're going through trauma." But therapy cost money too. Money I didn't have it, and every day I felt a new wave of fury that I was in a hospital bed, while my ex hopped from beach resort to candlelit dinners, laughing with the next naive victim. Some nights in a haze of pain and heartbreak, I wondered if I might die soon, as the doctors implied. If my immune system gave out, if the infection spread, would that be it? If so, did I want to spend my last days orchestrating a grand revenge, or did I want to find some measure of peace? It tore me apart. My sense of justice demanded retribution. My deeper longing was simply to move on, to be well again, to reclaim joy. I tried small acts of warning at least. I created anonymous social media posts that hinted at his identity, describing the abuse in detail, hoping someone might connect the dots and avoid him. But the responses were minimal. A few kind strangers expressed sympathy, but no large wave of condemnation fell on him. He carried on unscathed, as far as I knew. In calmer moments, I concluded that the best revenge might be living well, ignoring him, letting the universe handle his comeuppance. But living well was a challenge, considering my body ached daily and the bills loomed. So I wavered, sometimes telling myself, "I'll track down that doxing site next weekend," other times, "No, I'll focus on my recovery. Block him out of my thoughts." Even now, part of me stands at that crossroads. If I had the means to bankrupt him, a website to publicly shame him, would I do it? Possibly. He deserves consequences. But also, I can't shake the feeling that diving into vigilantism could consume whatever energy I have left. A dear friend of mine once said, "You can't heal if you're stuck in anger. That man wants you paralyzed by hati. Don't let him define your final chapter." Those words linger. My ex nearly killed me indeed, and in many ways he's still draining my life forces. Maybe the ultimate triumph is refusing to let him overshadow my every breath. It's far from easy. The bitterness remains, but maybe I can take small steps forward, channel the need for justice into safer, more constructive outlets. If I pull through the medical ordeals, my plan is to eventually compile my evidence, gather statements from his other exes, and see if we can press charges collectively. Maybe class action style. Maybe we can approach a lawyer or a women's advocacy group that takes on pro bono cases. Perhaps that is how we'll bring him down legally, in a thorough manner that doesn't risk me getting arrested for hacking or doxing. But for now, in the rawness of my pain, I vacillate. Sometimes I still Google how to leak info on X in the dead of night. Sometimes I open draft emails detailing his social security number or bank info, gleaned from the time we nearly moved in together. Then I stare at the send button, heart racing, adrenaline pounding. Invariably, I close the tab before doing anything irreversible. Fear, self-preservation, or perhaps the faint moral sense that stooping to his level might not truly free me. I wish the police did something. I wish the legal system cared enough to lock him up. I wish that I, disabled or not, could stand up in front of him in a courtroom and say, "You deserve punishment for the lives you've shattered." For the moment, that's not reality. So here I am, sharing my fictionalized story, wanting to know if leaking his information is too much. Part of me knows it might be crossing a line. Another part of me screams that after what he did, all lines are blurred. My heart begs for closure, for relief. Even if I can't find a serious hacker, the impulse remains, fueling me when nights get dark and pain intensifies. I suppose some might call me vindictive, but they haven't lived with bruises, with infections that threaten to shorten your lifespan, or with the knowledge that the man who inflicted them continues his charmed existence. If they had, maybe they'd understand my fury. At the end of this fictional recounting, I still don't know which path I'll choose. Part of me clings to hope for survival, for enough health to rebuild a life that's not defined by him. Another part whispers that the only justice might be for me to ensure everyone knows who he is, what he's done, so he can never walk into a fancy restaurant without the manager knowing he's an abuser. Right or wrong, these thoughts circle my mind like caged birds. Regardless, I'm left with the knowledge that I need to focus on my well-being, however precarious that might be. Some days I manage small steps, seeking medical treatments, leaning on friends for support, trying to plan a future that doesn't revolve around hatred. Other days, I want to burn his world down in a single stroke. That tension is my reality. Maybe, if there's a moral here, it's that survivors of abuse often feel torn between letting go and demanding vengeance. Neither path is pure. Both have consequences, and in that messy in-between, we sometimes find ourselves writing half-crazed messages, searching for ways to ruin our abusers, or sobbing into pillows with the knowledge that the system has failed us. But hope can exist in small pockets. Even if justice isn't immediate, even if the abuser's life goes on seemingly unpunished, the survivor's life can also continue, and maybe in time, hell, maybe the best revenge is living better than he ever allowed me to. Living despite the pain, the health challenges, the heartbreak. Maybe, in the end, that's what I have to hold on to as I fight to see tomorrow. So I continue, day by day, clinging to the possibility that my infections might be managed, that my heart might mend, that I might find reasons to laugh again. As for him, perhaps one day, he'll answer for his wrongs, either through some legal reckoning or by crossing the wrong person who does take him down. I can't predict. I just know that for me, survival and healing must come first, if I want to see a future not shaped by the darkest chapter of my past. In the meantime, I still wrestle with my fantasies of posting all his details in public. Well, it's a conflict that might not be resolved soon. But if you ask me in a quiet moment, is it too much? I might shrug and say, everything about this is too much. My illness is too much. The injustice is too much. The heartbreak is too much. And yet I'm still here. I'm still breathing. In fiction or in life, that alone might be the seed of my eventual freedom, and the real revenge on someone who tried to break me.